on behalf of the Friends of the Montana Historical Society. Today's program will be presented by Annie Hanshu, and she is a native of Helena, Montana, and has degrees from Carroll College and the University of Utah. Can everybody hear me okay? Her book, Border to Border, Historic Quilts and Quilt Makers of Montana, was published by the Montana Historical Society Press in 2009. She is one of the lead writers for the Montana Historical Society's Women's History Matters project. And you can read her essays on topics from women bootleggers to homemaker extension clubs at montanawomen'shistory.org. Please welcome Annie Hanshu.
Thank you. Does that do it, Martha, for the plug for Montana? This is montanawomen'shistorymatters.org. It's an awesome website. There's a much shorter version of the talk that I'm giving today on the website, and there's 2 blog entries published a week, and eventually it will all be combined into a book. But basically, throughout 2014, we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in Montana, and this is the place to go if you want to see what's happening. Okay, now if I can get back to PowerPoint. Okay, the title of my talk is Work Fit for Two-Fisted Rangers, Women in the U.S. Forest Service. Because Montana contains vast tracts of public lands, the U.S. Forest Service played an important role in the state in the 20th century. Now, in this talk, I'm going to bounce back and forth. I'm going to be telling the national story of women in the Forest Service and then also focusing on some specific Montana women, so it will be a little bit of each. But for those of you who are familiar with the Forest Service in Montana, Montana likes to think of itself as the epicenter of the Forest Service, especially Missoula thinks of itself as the epicenter of the Forest Service. So the Forest Service story is essentially our story, even if stuff happens in California. Known for its rough and tumble rangers and daring smoke jumpers, the Forest Service is seemingly synonymous with the rugged style of masculinity associated with Montana and the American West. Even Smokey Bear, with his bulky muscles and stern face, strikes one as the ultimate man's man. There's a picture of Smokey. It's a little harder to see in the costume, but a lot of times in drawings, what you'll notice is that Smokey has very defined pectoral muscles. He really is quite masculine, and you can see compared to the women in this picture, he's very tall and imposing as well. Women have worked for the Forest Service since its creation in 1905, but frequently their presence was unwelcome and their work unpaid. Throughout the 20th century, women's labor was indispensable to the Forest Service, but they consistently had to struggle against the masculine reputation of the agency and stereotypes that women were unsuited for forestry work. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s, when they moved into traditionally masculine fields like firefighting and law enforcement, that women were able to gain positions of leadership in the agency. So to give you a little roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today, what I'd like to do in this paper, or in this presentation, is first give a little background on the creation of the Forest Service, just because it's interesting and probably familiar to some of you, but not all of you. Next, I'm going to look specifically at women's work in the history of the Forest Service and look at a couple of case studies of women who have tried to break into the higher echelons of the Forest Service. And then finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts about where women stand in the agency today. After the Civil War, America launched into its second great phase of industrialization. As railroads connected the country and Americans pushed west to find more land and natural resources, some leaders and intellectuals began to worry about the fate of the nation's forests and water supplies. And you can see a lot of the leaders that I'll be referring to in this picture. So at the very end, we have Gifford Pinchot. In the middle, we have John Muir. And there, of course, is Teddy Roosevelt. Now, going back to Smokey the Bear, I have a theory that if you combine John Muir's beard with the physique of Smokey the Bear, you would actually have every man who attends Blackfoot on a regular basis. So it's a very Montana style of masculinity, even to this day. George Perkins Marsh was the most important intellectual leader of this movement, and the publication of his book Man and Nature in 1864 is often used to date the start of the American conservation movement. In it, Marsh wrote about the history of deforestation in Europe and argued that it was connected to other problems such as water flow and ground cover. Although Marsh's findings are today somewhat controversial, he did bring ecology and the interconnectedness of humans and the environments to the forefront in the American public. He also argued that because of humans' ability to dramatically change their ecosystems, people and their governments needed to assume a moral responsibility towards taking care of the land. So Marsh is really the first one who popularly gives us this idea that we need our leaders to get involved and manage lands. Otherwise, we're going to have a crisis, particularly with our forests and with our watersheds. The ideas of Marsh and others would eventually lead to the creation of the Forest Service. In 1876, Congress created the position of a forestry agent in the Department of Agriculture. This agent's job was to report on the state of America's forests. The first federal forest agent was a man named Charles Howe, or Huff. I sometimes pronounce that wrong. He wrote several reports that persuaded Congress to create a division of forestry in 1881. This division was still within the Department of Agriculture, which ironically did not actually hold or manage any forested lands. All public lands that did have forests on them were held by the Department of Interior. In 1891, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act, which gave the president the authority, quote, from time to time, quote, to establish, quote, public reservations of any public land with forests or forest undergrowth. The act didn't have any provisions for the management of lands, nor did it allocate money to them. But it did allow then President of the United States, President Harrison, to create the first forest reserve in the United States. That was the Yellowstone Park Timberland Reserve, which included land around the southern edge of the park. Lands set aside under the Forest Reserve Act were held by the Department of Interior, not the Division of Forestry. So on the one hand, you have foresters who are studying ecology and studying how forests work and how best to manage them. And then on the other hand, you have the Forest Reserve System, which is in the Department of Interior rather than the Department of Agriculture. After Gifford Pinchot became head of the Division of Forestry in 1898, he worked relentlessly, and I would say almost Machiavellianly, to get the reserves moved into the Department of Agriculture so that the forest reserves that were being created would be managed by foresters. He was helped by the fact that he was close friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Both were members of the Boone and Crockett Club, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, and they both had an interest in preserving the nation's forests. So being friends with Roosevelt sort of sealed the deal and helped Pinchot move the forest reserves over into the Department of Agriculture. So that in 1905, with the transfer of the reserves to the Department of Agriculture, the Division of Forestry was renamed the U.S. Forest Service, and we got the agency that we have today. That background is all just to say that the Forest Service was officially created in 1905, but it has a much longer history. And what I'm going to do next is talk about the context of masculinity in this time period, the late 19th century, so that we can really understand the buildup to the Forest Service and the role that Americans' ideas about American masculinity, and especially masculinity in the American West, played in the creation of the Forest Service. I know this is a talk about women's history. I think that you can't really talk about women without talking about men, which is unfortunate. We don't exist in a vacuum, ladies, especially in an agency like the Forest Service, which has such a strongly masculine culture. You really have to deal with men's attitudes and sort of the culture that they set before you can understand where women fit into the picture and really the struggles that they went to fit into that picture. The Forest Service was created at a time when the American West held an increasingly important role in the American psyche. And I think I missed a slide here. Oh, yep, see, Western masculinity. Men and wildfire. This, as an aside, this is a brochure that was at the Smoke Jumper Visitor Center in Missoula, and I can't find the exact date, but it was in the 1970s or maybe even in the early 1980s. So there's still a very strong idea in that time period that the people who fight wildfire are men, and that really sort of went unquestioned, and it was how the Forest Service promoted itself. Okay, so the Forest Service is created at a time when we're really kind of obsessed with the American West. And this national myth starts to develop around the idea that there's an intimate connection between masculinity and Western wilderness. We see this powerful narrative forming that glorifies men who work in the woods. You can see it in James Fenimore Cooper's novels. You can see it in The Legend of Paul Bunyan, which developed in this time period. And you can also see it in historian Frederick Jackson Turner's writings about the frontier. In all of these different places, men are writing about how important wilderness, and especially wilderness in the American West, is to masculine identity. This frontier woodsman tradition is popularized at the end of the 19th century by one of my favorite characters in American history and our former president, Theodore Roosevelt. He really takes this idea of the rugged Western man and he creates himself into that man, and then he also makes it the popular image to which all other American men are supposed to aspire. Roosevelt's style of masculinity comes to imbue Americans' understandings of the West, and it was deeply intertwined with notions about nature, wilderness, and savagery. At the turn of the century, as historian Gail Baderman has carefully outlined, middle-class white Americans were worried that industrialization and urban life were starting to create soft, weak, effeminate men. So historians of masculinity look to this time period and they say that there was a crisis in masculinity in America in this time period. We worried that Americans were losing their manhood, largely because of the effects of industrialization and urbanization. So at the time, we had sort of this Victorian ideal of self-restrained manliness. A man, I don't know, I picture him in a bowler hat for some reason, who is very stoic and calm, but that starts to be replaced by a much more savage, violent, rugged version of masculinity. And the idea is that we need to go out into the woods and sort of recapture America's greatness by restoring our manhood. Roosevelt's initial foray into politics coincides with this shift in masculine ideals that is happening. And initially, when he entered politics in New York, people made fun of him, especially because of the way he dressed. They said that he was an effeminate dandy. He grew up very sickly, so and he had a lot of respiratory problems, so they made fun of him for being weak. So Roosevelt retreats to the Badlands after his wife passes away, but one of the things that he's doing by going out to the West is remaking his masculinity so that he can no longer be charged as being an effeminate dandy. And the reason that the Badlands worked so well for Roosevelt is that he regarded the wilderness as a proving ground for manly prowess. Through the act of battling nature and conquering nature, in Roosevelt's case, a lot of times that involved hunting large game. Through the act of battling nature, men were able to reclaim the important virtues that they were losing through industrialization. And by virtues, I mean things like aggressiveness, physicality, muscularity, independence was always an idea that was associated with the West, but it became increasingly important to our ideas about men. There's a description of the ideal Western man that is articulated by the Boone and Crockett Club, which is a hunting and conservation club that Roosevelt and Pinchot and George Bird Grinnell were all very prominent members of. And they say that the ideal man is, quote, of sound body and firm of mind, possessing energy, resolution, manliness, self-reliance, and capacity for self-help. The spaces of the American West work to regenerate this type of manhood because nature, which has seemingly been tamed and erased in the East, still serves as a worthy adversary beyond the Mississippi. So in a very real way, Roosevelt's work during his presidency to set aside and conserve public lands stemmed from his concern not only that nature was dying, but also that American men were dying as well. And by saving one, you would be saving the other. And by extension, at least in Roosevelt's vision, restoring America to its national greatness. When the 1890 census declares the frontier closed, Roosevelt feared the loss of the West as a crucial staging ground for American manhood, and the preservation of Western spaces became one of his primary political goals. The creation and expansion of the Forest Service, then, can be seen as part of his effort to regenerate America's masculinity. Now, that's a long bit on masculinity, but the important thing to realize is that gender back at the turn of that century was a lot different than gender at the turn of this current century that we're in. Masculinity in that time period was synonymous with men. So when we were working to restore American manhood through a lot of different means, but through agencies like the Forest Service, women were deliberately left out of that equation. There wasn't really any point in including them because the point was to build good, solid American men. However, women have always worked for the Forest Service, so they had to sort of negotiate this culture as they went along. In the early 20th century, women were generally limited to clerical positions in the Forest Service, and in some cases, even these feminine jobs were off limits to them. Albert Cousins was an early forestry professional, and he recalled that some foresters preferred to hire men even for clerical and office work, which is work that we would stereotypically associate with women. And this is a quote from Cousins. The employment of women clerks in the supervisor's office was not looked upon with favor, and the policy was established to employ men only. The idea being that a woman clerk could not handle the, quote, rough work required in the administration of a forest, such as assembling and shipping fire tools, rustling firefighters, etc. Such work properly was for a, quote, two-fisted ranger or forest officer. However, it was not long before it became apparent that there was another element in forest officers' work which had not been taken into consideration. That was, and this is all caps in Cousins' account, paperwork, reports, letters to forest users, etc. Such work proved to be too much for the two-fisted rangers and supervisors. So it's funny because there's this attitude that women can't even handle firefighting equipment, right? If we're talking about somebody who worked in one of these early ranger stations, a lady might be, helping the guys get ready to go out on the fire, but she certainly wouldn't have been going out on the fire herself, except if she did so of her own volition. But there was an attitude, at least, that women shouldn't even be around this type of equipment or around those type of men. However, women proved to be useful at the other clerical duties associated with the Forest Service. So that in the 1910s, the types of positions that women were commonly found in were things like clerical typewriter positions, but also technical drawing, some data collection and analysis, as long as the job didn't involve going out into the field and collecting that data. The main rule in this time period was that women were largely excluded from field work. It was felt that they shouldn't be going out and working in the forests themselves. There was one important exception to this rule in the early 20th century, and that was the hiring of women as fire lookouts. Women were occasionally hired as lookouts. The official policy was that they were supposed to call a male firefighter if they saw a fire. So they could spot a fire, but they couldn't go out and fight it themselves, although based on their accounts, many did, because it was a ridiculous waste of time to wait for a male firefighter to hike into a fire that was close to you. Haley Daggett was the first female Forest Service lookout. She worked at the Eddy's Gulch Lookout Station in the Klamath National Forest. She started in the summer of 1913. And an article in the 1914 issue of American Forestry talked about Daggett and some of the reservations about hiring her. And this is quoting from that. Some of the servicemen predicted that after a few days of life on the peak, she would telephone that she was frightened by the loneliness and the danger. But she was full of pluck and high spirit, and she grew more and more in love with the work, even when the telephone wires were broken, and when for a long time she was cut off from communication with the world below. She did not lose heart. She not only filled the place with all the skill which a trained man could have shown, but she desires to be reappointed when the fire season opens this year. So I love the idea that the greatest danger to a woman is perhaps that she doesn't have a telephone. But Daggett actually went on to serve as a lookout for 14 seasons. She came back the next year and stayed after that. So she certainly enjoyed the position. So fire lookouts are the one exception to the rule in terms of women being able to perform field service. For the most part, women couldn't be hired in the field. The irony in this period is that women's work was actually indispensable to the Forest Service, but it was unofficial and unpaid. The best example of this is the work of rangers' wives on the forests. They provide an invaluable source of free labor for the ranger districts, which at that time really didn't have sufficient staff or sufficient funds. The wives of rangers would perform clerical work. They cooked and cleaned for the forestry staff and firefighters if they were there. And there are even stories of them going out and fighting fires themselves in emergencies. A description of one ranger's wife's role on the forest said, quote, "She was alone and had entire charge of getting men, pack outfits, and provisions together, hiring horses for them and sending them to the fires, and according to Mr. Mackenzie, who was the district ranger, she did better than any man could have done, including himself," which is, maybe he meant it, maybe he didn't, but that's a smart husband. One such ranger's wife was Harriet Eveleth of Monarch, Montana. According to historian Jamie Lewis, she, quote, "purportedly left her 3 small children behind during the big blowup of 1910 and rode 20 miles on horseback from Monarch to Nyhart, Montana to take charge of 100 men fighting a fire, not knowing whether the fire would jump the ravine and claim her home and family." This daring act, going out and helping these firefighters during the big blowup, earned Eveleth the nickname of, quote, "the Paul Revere of the belts." The situation starts to shift during World War II. That's true in a lot of jobs when you're looking at women's history. It's equally true in the Forest Service. What happens is that the draft and the war cause labor shortages, and this sort of forces the Forest Service to allow more women into field work. So during the war, women start to work as fire patrols. They cook on the fire line. They're truck drivers. There are even some who work as loggers and scale timber. This shift really is only temporary. After the war, returning GIs replaced the women in these jobs, and the Forest Service resumed its practice of discouraging women from applying for fieldwork positions. A 1950s employment leaflet explained, quote, "The fieldwork of the Forest Service is strictly a man's job because of the arduous nature of the work and the work environment." So the Forest Service is going back to the status quo after World War II, but really the world around the Forest Service starts to change in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Encouraged by the growing women's rights movement of the 1960s, women start to challenge the position of the Forest Service. And I'm skipping ahead just a little bit. I'm particularly interested in firefighters, so the rest of the talk is going to be just a little bit firefighter heavy, but I hope it's interesting. On July 6, 1971, an article in the New York Times announced, quote, "Women have invaded another traditionally all-male stronghold, the domain of the professional forest firefighter." At the behest of 21-year-old Janet Mitchell, whom the article described as, quote, "a petite 115-pounder from Boston, Massachusetts." So not only was she tiny, but she was from the East. The Forest Service had formed an all-female fire crew in Lolo, Montana. The fire control officer who trained this new crew described the women as, quote, "green, but their enthusiasm and determination will help them develop into a tough unit." He also issued this warning to the, quote, girls, and they were always referred to as girls in these articles, quote, "You might as well accept it. There's going to be some tough woods boss who doesn't think much of the idea of women's lib." And he was probably right. There certainly seems to be evidence that there was resistance, if not to these specific women, then to the idea of women entering field work in the Forest Service in general. Nevertheless, the concept of these all-female crews spread from Missoula to other regions of the Forest Service. And by the second half of the 1970s, women were actually just being integrated into male crews instead of segregated out into their own crews. Now we're going to talk about smoke jumpers. Smoke jumpers have long been considered, or at least they consider themselves, to be the elite of the Forest Service. The story of the first female smoke jumper, whose name was Deanna Schulman, offers an interesting case study for looking at women in the Forest Service. Her struggle for inclusion in the program illustrates the level of resistance felt by women who tried to break into the Forest Service upper ranks. Now, this really has nothing to do with her story, but this is one of my favorite pictures. This is a group of Girl Scouts. I think that they were actually visiting a forest in Oregon, so it's not a Montana picture, but they're Missoula Girl Scouts, so they're a little bit familiar with the smoke jumping program. And the torture rack was one of the training devices used at the time. So there's all these great pictures. This is my favorite, but basically the Forest Service has a whole PR folder showing that the girls could actually do these physical activities that were supposed to be, the training activities for the very best firefighters of the Forest Service. So this is these girls using the torture rack. They don't seem to be enjoying it, but at least they're getting it done. I don't see how anyone would enjoy that. Okay. Deanna Schulman was accepted into rookie training at the McCall, Idaho smoke jumper base in 1979. She had worked as a seasonal firefighter since 1974, and she had already broken new ground when she joined the Los Padres Hotshot crew in Santa Barbara, California. The Hotshots are another elite firefighting organization in the Forest Service. So she had already been the first female hotshot in the Forest Service Pacific Southwest region. In 1979, she decided to undergo rookie training for the McCall smoke jumping program. And she knew that she had a series of physical hurdles to overcome. On the first day, rookie smoke jumpers had to complete 45 sit-ups, 25 push-ups, 7 pull-ups, and a 1.5-mile run in under 11 minutes. These tests, it was thought, were necessary to measure the absolute minimum level of fitness that was required to perform the labor that a smoke jumper would have to do. So passing those tests was a prerequisite for continuing rookie training. Shulman prepared very carefully for the fitness tests, but one of the requirements posed a particular danger to her. There were also height and weight requirements within the smoke jumping program at the time. She was taller than the 5'5" height minimum, but there was also a 130-pound weight minimum, and she was about 5 pounds short of that, especially with all of the working out that she was doing. She got ready for training by bulking up to the minimum weight just for the weigh-in. She said that she was on a daily diet of, quote, ice cream, cookies, pastries, and candy. But then, between just the nervousness of having to go through the training and also the strenuous physical activity that she was performing, she was back down to 125 pounds when she was actually weighed in. So she was under the weight requirement, but she was allowed to complete all the physical tests on the first day. She later recalled, quote, I finished the last pull-up and dropped from the bar, and one of the experienced smoke jumpers gave me a secret wink of support. There had been much speculation among the jumpers on my fitness test performance, and it seems I had passed the hurdle. So it was encouraging. The next day, the base manager called her into his office and terminated her for being underweight. Devastated and quite suddenly unemployed, Shulman traveled back to California and eventually found work as a fire prevention technician at the Lake Tahoe Basin. As she was there, and as her story spread, she began to hear stories about other smoke jumpers who had failed to meet the minimum weight and height requirements, but were still allowed to jump. The minimum weight requirement was largely based on the idea of the weight you would need to be at in order to carry a 100-pound pack. But men who were able to carry a pack that size in spite of being underweight had been allowed exceptions and been allowed to jump. Shulman wasn't even extended the opportunity to try. Several people she confided in encouraged her to call a man named Alan Owen. He was then, at that time, the smoke jumper squad boss at Cave Junction, Oregon. Owen was a former Marine and Vietnam veteran whose nickname was Mouse. He was 4 foot 10 inches tall and 110 pounds. He had been jumping at Cave Junction since 1970. He was, as Shulman recalls, quote, indignant and outraged at the infringement on my rights as an American citizen. His philosophy was that each individual has the right to compete for any job, and proven performance should be the only criterion for success. The gender issues of whether women, quote, ought to be smoke jumpers, quote, seemed completely irrelevant to him, and I loved him for that. So talking with Mouse emboldens Shulman, and she wrote a letter to the supervisor of the Piatt National Forest. Although she acknowledged being underweight, she went on to point out some of the exceptions that had been made for men in the past. And in her letter, she wrote, quote, perhaps my being a woman was the factor that promoted such an unusually strict application of the requirements in my particular case. She continued in her letter, quote, it is quite obvious that a much higher percentage of physically fit men fulfill these height and weight requirements than physically fit women. Therefore, men and women do not have an equal chance for smoke jumper employment. The supervisor sent what Shulman called an impersonal response, assuring her that her termination had nothing to do with her sex. So, and she was continued to be encouraged by Mouse and other smoke jumpers who were on her side. She decided to file an equal employment opportunity complaint. When the complaint was resolved in May of 1980, Shulman received back pay for her summer of 1979 when she didn't get to complete training as a smoke jumper. She also received overtime because smoke jumpers generally get lots of overtime. So the complaint was resolved internally by the Forest Service, and she was compensated for not being able to jump. She was also offered a job at McCall with the proviso that she weigh 130 pounds on the day of her appointment. If she lost weight after that, it would be okay. She didn't have to maintain that weight throughout the summer. When she returned to McCall, she weighed in at 132 pounds, and she successfully completed rookie training on July 10th. She jumped at McCall for 5 seasons before moving on to a career in fire management. I think her story is really interesting just because of the whole issues surrounding ideas about physicality and the body, those height and weight requirements that seemed to be stacked in favor of men. But once she sort of breaks into the smoke jumper program, other women are able to follow in her footsteps. They do, however, continue to encounter suspicion and resistance to integration. Kim Maynard, who started as a firefighter and worked as a smoke jumper in Missoula from 1982 to 1984, recalled the atmosphere of anxiety when she and Wendy Comm arrived for smoke jumper training. Quote, "They had a sexual harassment class and they discussed, quote, 'Well, fellas, things are changing. Now when you have to take a pee, you have to go behind the bushes.'" I love how concerns about equality, women's equality, always get back to bathrooms one way or the other. It also said, "And you have to watch out for sexual harassment because you could easily get sued. And people were just scared of us. Nobody would talk to us. They thought any second that we were going to sue them." So there is at least fear among the part of the male counterparts. I've also heard stories that nobody will let me record and officially capture, that there were hazing rituals as well. One story I heard was that the first year that Schulman did finally get to jump, somebody came in and painted a woman's naked body on her smoke jumper suit. So there were other forms of harassment. And the way the story went is that she just jumped in it anyway and got a new suit later on, which I think is pretty cool. But so women are breaking through the ranks of the Forest Service in the 1970s and 1980s. Some of them are doing it kind of quietly, like Schulman did. I mean, she did have to threaten to sue, but eventually she was able to work something out. There are other cases where women have to use legal means to kind of force the Forest Service into action. We'll talk about this book in a minute. Jean Bernardi was a U.S. Forest Service research sociologist for the Pacific Southwest Forest and Range Experiment Station in Berkeley, California. She worked there from 1968 to 1975. In 1972, she filed a formal complaint of sex discrimination against the Forest Service for being refused a merited promotion and a raise in pay. After several appeals and discrimination suits, Bernardi actually filed a class action suit on behalf of all women in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The suit, Bernardi versus Butts, was filed in 1973 and finally resolved in 1979 when the U.S. Forest Service agreed to a consent decree that was approved by the district court in 1981. The consent decree sets up some legal requirements for the Forest Service. Basically, the idea is that the Forest Service needed to hire women in the same proportions that they existed within the civilian workforce. So the number that they came up with this in this time period was that the Forest Service had to hire 43% women. They were initially supposed to do that over 5 years. That date was later extended. Another part of the consent decree was that women or that the agency had to increase the number of women at higher pay grades. So it wouldn't be sufficient to just hire more typists and clerical workers. You needed to increase women at higher pay grades. And the way the Forest Service structure works, a lot of those higher pay grades are field work. So the two problems are interconnected, women going into the field and women getting more money. They're both sort of intertwined. The consent decree was in effect for the Forest Service until 1992. While it was welcomed by many women within the agency, it did and continues to draw strong criticism from, sometimes from men in the agency. What I find is that it's mostly men outside of the agency who dislike it for its use of a quota system and also for the concept of reverse discrimination. The tinderbox is, if you can see the subtitle, How Politically Correct Ideology Destroyed the U.S. Forest Service. It's a 450-page almost tome about how the hiring of women and also the hiring of minorities, which is another problem that the Forest Service is dealing with in this time, how the hiring of those groups really destroyed the agency. I won't go into the argument or the logic, but it's long and it's not isolated by any means. There's still people who are rankled by affirmative action within the Forest Service. Okay. To me, one of the most interesting things about the masculine culture of the Forest Service is its really kind of stubborn persistence, especially in light of the sweeping changes that we see in the 20th century, both in terms of gender roles, but also in environmental thought. The modern environmental movement, second wave feminism, and a growing critique of the Forest Service policies would all seem to undercut this sort of masculine bravado that the Forest Service was originally founded on. But you can still find it in some places, not everywhere, not everywhere by any means. Change is happening, but it seems that it's happening slowly. The transition of women into male-dominated field positions in the 70s and 80s really ends up being essential for those who want a career in forestry. Clerical jobs and office-based jobs really didn't serve as stepping stones into positions of leadership in the agency. This is another reason why women firefighters and women smoke jumpers are important. Those were the type of jobs that were seen as a training ground for leadership, especially the smoke jumper program. A lot of people assumed that if you could be a smoke jumper, then maybe you were well suited to go on to other leadership positions with the agency. So women breaking into field work really helps them sort of rise up in the ranks and prove themselves capable of greater levels of leadership. As they move into traditionally masculine fields like law enforcement and firefighting, they gain the experience that allows them to grow up the ranks. So that in 2007, we have Abigail Kimball. She was then in charge of the Forest Service Northern Region, headquartered in Missoula. As I said, Missoula is the center of it all. She was elevated to the position of Chief Forester, making her the first woman to hold the office. And with that, I think we have a little bit of time for questions.